Hey, I'm Jesse. Let's have a devotion. We're in Exodus chapter 14. We're going to go through verses 15 through 25. The Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. As for you, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. As for me, I am going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army, and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who was going in front of the Israelite forces, moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. It came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. There was a cloud and darkness. It lit up the night, and neither group came near the other all night long. All right, so let's talk about this portion of text. In yesterday's devotion, we saw how God had called the Israelites to what looked like a dead end. He had called them to go a route that avoided war, but he brought them face to face with the Red Sea. And this is to set the stage for his own miraculous deliverance of his people. He has also hardened the hearts of Pharaoh and his officials. They had Moses in high favor, and now they all feel like they've changed their minds about Moses. They've forgotten about the plagues. They've forgotten about the deaths of their firstborn sons. They've forgotten that Pharaoh himself told Israel to get out. And when Israel gets out, they're like, what have we done? And their thoughts immediately go to their own economic losses as a result of the forfeiture of their chattel slaves. And so with these divinely hardened hearts, they are going way overboard. They have just put all of their best chariots, Pharaoh's own chariot, 600 of the best chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt. That's your best weapon you've got in war. And they're pursuing their own former slaves, and they're going right toward the Red Sea. And as they're being pursued, as the Israelites see the Egyptians coming, they begin to turn on Moses, and they begin to cry out to God. And Moses' word to them is to stand firm, to not be afraid, to trust in the Lord and see what he's going to accomplish for them that day, that the Lord himself would fight. They needed only to be quiet. They're crying out to God. They're slandering Moses. What they need to do is be quiet and trust the Lord. And now the Lord has responded in today's text. Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. Okay, it's time to go. And then as for you, Moses, you lift up your staff over the sea. And now he's promised a miracle. He's told Moses to do the impossible. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it. So that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. He's just told Moses to do something that is physically impossible. But at this point, God has used Moses, told him every time he calls Moses to raise up that staff, he accomplishes something miraculous. And he's not done either. That staff is going to be instrumental in God's instructions to Moses to bring about victory over the Amalekites, for example. And now God says what he's going to do. Right? As for you, do this thing that makes no pragmatic sense. Okay? Lift up this stick. Right? Like split the Red Sea in half. That's your job, Moses. Here's what I'm going to do. So everything about following God in this situation is just pure faith. God has told Moses to do something that to the pure pragmatist from a materialist worldview makes no sense. The most powerful nation in the world is coming after you with the most sophisticated military weapons. Their whole fleet of them, the best they've got. I want you to lift up that stick. Okay. When you put it that way, it looks absurd from a pragmatic worldview, but it's not absurd at all. All right. The Israelites are in no danger, and the Egyptians are moving full speed toward a greater danger than they can possibly imagine. God's using all of this so that he gets the glory. He's always done this. Redemption history wide, he does this. It's how he gets glorified in the weakness of his people, where his strength is demonstrated. There's no one who can look back on the event that happened in the Red Sea this miraculous victory for God, and say, you know what, that was some good military strategy on Israel's part. Some solid leadership from guys like her and Aaron. No, man. God gets 100% of the glory. God gets 100% of the credit. This is one of the things that our worship team will pray before leading worship on Sunday mornings. We forego all the glory. All right. If somebody wants to compliment the quality of the music, the worship team will say in response, praise God, because they're not making music to get compliments. All right. They're making music for the glory of God. We forego all of our rights to the royalties for the glory of the good things that God accomplishes in our lives, because he's the one who accomplished them. God is the one who is setting the stage to receive glory for himself, which is absolutely right for him to do. Now, this phrase, the angel of God, it can be confusing because when you see angel, you start picturing, like oftentimes like artistic depictions, we'll show sort of like feminine looking angels. There are no feminine looking angels. None in the Word of God. And like it's rather a reference to this manifestation of the presence of God on the earth. When they left Egypt, this pillar of cloud by day would go before them, and this pillar of fire by night. Okay, we started with 70 people. And then over the course of this time in Egypt, where the Israelites gradually lost their freedoms and their favor with Pharaoh, and generations passed by, and now you've got like over 600,000 men according to the book of Numbers, which means you've got probably 600,000+ women, and so you've got 1.2 million plus adults. By the time the Exodus is over, the next generation is going to grow even more, and you've got this huge crowd of people. And that means that this pillar of cloud, this pillar of fire must have been massive, because they're in military formation, which they've never done before. Everybody who's doing this has been born and raised as a slave, and now they're free. But they're assuming military formation. Can you imagine what that was like? How do we do this? Do this right? We line up like this? How do you hold this thing? I don't know what I'm doing. And so they're forming military formation because they know that they're going to fight. God has led them away from war for now. That's coming later. They do have an enemy. He prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. They are safe in God's will, but that doesn't mean that the enemy's not out there. That doesn't mean that they won't suffer. That doesn't mean they won't be attacked. They're being attacked right now because God hardened the hearts of their attackers, for crying out loud. And so they're in military formation. There's over 1 million of them. And when you spread 1 million people across any landmass, if everybody's able to follow this pillar of cloud by day, this pillar of fire by night, it must be massive. And so there they are following, get this, the light of the world. You see this foreshadowing of Jesus. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men prefer darkness to light because their deeds are evil. We likewise are following the light of the world. And so the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night is in front of the Israelites. But something changes in this text. This manifestation of the presence of God, referred to as the angel of God, who is going in front of the Israelite forces. We know this from this past week's curriculum text. Was in front of them, and now it's behind them. Why is that? It's because it's coming between the Israelites and their enemies. And there was a cloud and darkness, and it lit up the night, and neither group came near the other all night. You want to know what the Egyptians and the Israelites both have in common? They both fear God in a way. The Israelites revere Yahweh as Lord. The Egyptians are afraid, are stricken with terror at what they're beholding. Verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. We've seen this verbiage before in the book of Exodus, this strong east wind. This is what brought this powerful east wind. This is what brought the locusts in one of the plagues. And now here's that same verbiage again, this powerful east wind. Some people will look at verse 21 and try to give a naturalistic explanation. When I say some people, I'm talking about Christians. I'm talking about apologists. I'm talking about people with huge online platforms. They'll look at verse 21 to the neglect of verse 22. So they try to provide this naturalistic explanation. We're not exactly sure where Baal Zephon is geographically, and maybe it's here, maybe it's there, and there is this sort of shallow portion of one of the bays of the Red Sea, and it does kind of look like people may have crossed there at one point. And to this day, when the tides are right and there's a drought and there's a strong wind, it can look kind of like a big mud puddle, and maybe that's what Exodus that's what Exodus 14:21 is describing. No, read verse 22. The waters were like a wall to them on their right and their left. This is a miracle. This is a miracle of God. We're going to use a powerful east wind to explain, some anomaly in locust migratory patterns now too. This is a miracle of God. It's miraculous wind that causes the water to behave in a way that makes no hydrological sense. Water like a wall on both sides of you. This is miraculous. This is physics defying to the glory of God. It is God who authored the laws of physics, and it's God's prerogative to break those laws for his own glory. That's exactly what he did. And that's why you and I are reading this text right now, to the glory of God. So this is not there's not a naturalistic explanation for this. This is a miracle of God. Okay, you're going to use a naturalistic explanation to explain this part too, verse 20, the pillar of cloud, the angel of God. Yes, this was a climatological anomaly. No, this is a miracle of God. Verse 23, the Egyptians set out in pursuit, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and went into the sea after them. During the morning watch, the Lord looked down at the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud. I want to just zoom in on these words right here. We use the word look down in a pejorative sense to convey a sense of condescension. It's viewed as inappropriate for one person to look down on another. This is the only way for God to look at humans, down at us. We're his creation. The Lord looked down at the Egyptian forces. Egyptian forces here, of course, are the enemies of the people of God. They've been hardened in their hearts by God because God is setting the stage for a miraculous deliverance that would bring him glory. And it's now the year that it is, and we're reading this text. So evidently, God did exactly what he wanted to do. So God looks down on the enemies of his people from the pillar of fire and cloud, and threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. This is fascinating. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. We'll come back and talk about this. Let's get away from Israel, the Egyptians said, because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Ruh-roh, this is that moment where suddenly they remember the gnats and the darkness and the locusts and the frogs and the blood, and they remember the plagues, and suddenly it dawns on them the stupidity of what they're doing. They're going against the people of God. Let's get away from Israel. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. And now they finally acknowledge the Lord, at least in proper terror, acknowledging themselves to be his enemies. Now here's where we'll close. God is the one who caused their chariot wheels to swerve. Now we've seen artifacts of ancient Egyptian chariot wheels. They look like they're solid gold, but there's actually this thin layer of gold over the wheel. There's also some fake news sites. I mean, it's pretty remarkable how what people will do for a click these days. But there's no reason, based on what we know of their ancient chariot technology, to think that their wheels were insufficient. This is God causing difficulty This is God throwing them into confusion. Verse 24. He's the one who caused the perfectly well made, perhaps gold plated, at least in Pharaoh's case, chariot wheels to swerve. And he made them drive with difficulty. It's one of the ministries of God that's overlooked. A ministry of sabotage. A ministry of sabotage. I feel like God has done this to me before. All right, this is one of the seldom taught ministries of the Lord. God, the divine thwarter, as John Eldridge has called him. I can't endorse all of John Eldridge's theology, but this is biblically sound because this is something that God did to the enemies of his people after hardening their hearts. Are things just not working that should work? You follow the formula perfectly. You did everything right. And it's just difficult. It's confusing. It's not working. The wheels aren't turning properly. Would you stop for a minute and consider, like, hang on a second. Am I being one of the Egyptians? Am I working against God? Is this going against God's will? This is how God thwarted the Egyptians. Their point of greatest pride, their sophisticated, perhaps gold-plated, military-grade chariots aren't functioning. They're turning with great difficulty. The Israelites are able to just walk on dry ground, but these chariots can't seem to turn. And their own confusion, their inability to communicate and understand what they're doing, that's all from God. God, the divine thwarter. So consider for a moment that you may have forgotten this is one of the things that God does. He has thwarted and confused the enemy. He is bringing glory to himself. All of this was articulated in verse 18. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So they looked pretty glorious, all, just driving out of Egypt, perhaps in formation. And I'll bet it was a spectacle to behold. All right, imagine the U.S. Air Force just parading our F-35 Lightning IIs. All right, wow, there goes the best weaponry of our day. And the Lord is going to receive glory. He looks down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian forces. And he has already told us what would happen in verse 18. I'm the Lord. I'm going to receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And then that is exactly what happens in verse 25. What was foretold in verse 18 is realized in verse 25 by a means of God's seldom taught ministry, the divine God of righteous thwarting and sabotage. Would you thank God, not just for the great things that he has done for you, but would you thank God for the things that he has thwarted?